Dear learners, welcome back to WSE English Story, where language learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, we enter the heart of America's past to discover a story that is both controversial and inspiring. It is the story of a family who built an empire from tobacco, a product that brought both fortune and debate, and then transformed that empire into something that would outlive them, a university dynasty. This is the story of the Duke family. From the soil of North Carolina, where life was once harsh and opportunities were scarce, the Dukes rose with determination, resilience, and vision. They turned hardship into power, and power into legacy. Yet behind their success lay conflict, moral dilemmas, fierce competition, and the burden of shaping a future from something many considered destructive. For you as English learners, this is more than just history. This is a journey through struggle, triumph, and the meaning of legacy. As we follow the Dukes, you will not only improve your English listening and comprehension but also reflect on human courage, ambition, and the choices that change generations. If you'd like to support our work, you're welcome to like, comment, share, or join us. Your support means a lot and helps us keep creating meaningful content for learners everywhere. Get ready for a powerful story of ambition, sacrifice, and transformation. Let's begin the journey of the Duke family, the tobacco empire that built a university dynasty. To understand the rise of the Duke family, we must first step back to North Carolina in the early 1800s. This was a place of red clay soil, long summers, and fields that demanded hard work. Life was rural, modest, and often uncertain. Families depended on farming for survival, and the rhythm of life followed the land and the seasons. It was here, in 1820, that Washington Duke was born. His family was poor, with no wealth to inherit, no great name to protect them. Like many young men of the South, he knew that survival depended on strength, endurance, and faith. Farming was tough, and opportunities for education were almost non-existent. Washington Duke grew up not in classrooms but in the fields, with his hands in the soil and his heart shaped by hardship. The mid-19th century was also a time of deep division in America. The Civil War loomed over the horizon, and slavery was still entrenched in the South. Wealthy plantation owners controlled vast lands and political power, while small farmers like the Duke struggled to compete. Washington Duke never owned slaves. Instead, he worked his own land. This distinction would later give him a different reputation in a region where the legacy of slavery cast a long shadow. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Washington Duke was already middle-aged. Like many men of his region, he was drawn into the conflict. He served in the Confederate Navy, far from home and family. But the war left him not with glory, but with loss. When he returned, he found his farm in ruins, his barns empty, and his future uncertain. The South after the Civil War was a broken land. Plantations were destroyed, money was worthless, and hunger was widespread. For many, despair was the only companion. But Washington Duke looked at the ashes of his life and began to imagine something new. He needed a crop that could grow quickly, sell for profit, and provide a path forward. That crop was tobacco. At first, tobacco was nothing glamorous. It was grown in small batches, dried in barns, and sold locally. But Washington Duke saw in it not just a plant, but a possibility. He began with a handful of seeds and a will to fight back against poverty. Slowly, he started to rebuild, supported by his children, who worked alongside him in the fields. From these beginnings, humble, uncertain, and born of hardship, would come one of the most powerful family empires in America. Yet at this stage, No one could have guessed that the boy who grew up with nothing, and the man who returned from war to ruins, would one day have his name tied to one of the world's great universities. Washington Duke's decision to turn to tobacco was not a clear or easy path. After the Civil War, countless small farmers tried to recover by planting the same crop. The market was uncertain, prices were unstable, and competition was fierce. What separated survival from failure was not simply hard work, it was vision, courage, and the ability to take risks when everything seemed impossible. Washington began in the simplest way. With little money and no machinery, he relied on his children to help him roll and prepare tobacco by hand. They worked in a small cabin on their property, stripping leaves, drying them, and twisting them into crude rolls. These were loaded onto wagons, and Washington Duke himself would ride for miles to nearby towns to sell them. The profit was meager, often just enough to keep the family fed. Yet every journey carried hope. But the real problem was larger than money. The South at this time was broken, not only in its economy but also in its spirit. Many men returned from war with anger and despair, while communities were divided by poverty and racial tension. To rise in such an environment required more than ambition, it demanded resilience and, at times, a willingness to stand apart. Washington Duke was known as a man of integrity, a rarity in a time when many took advantage of desperation. Still, honesty did not guarantee success. The first big challenge came with expansion. As tobacco demand began to grow, Washington and his sons tried to sell beyond their local area. But transportation was difficult, roads were rough, and competition from larger, better-equipped farmers threatened to crush small operations like theirs. Buyers often refused to pay fair prices, knowing that desperate farmers had no choice. The Dukes were pushed to the edge many times, struggling to keep the business alive. There was also the moral question. Tobacco was not food, nor was it a necessity for survival. Even then, some considered it a dangerous indulgence, something that wasted both money and health. Washington Duke must have felt the weight of this judgment, especially as a deeply religious man. Was he building his family's future on something that might harm others? Yet for him, tobacco was the only way to provide stability for his children. The burden of poverty was far heavier than the doubts he carried about the crop. Still, hope came in small steps. Every wagonload of tobacco that sold meant more seeds for the next planting, more barns repaired, and more opportunities for his sons. Washington believed fiercely in perseverance, teaching his children that failure was never final unless one gave up. This lesson became the foundation of the Duke legacy. But the challenges were far from over. The market for tobacco was shifting. Customers wanted something more refined than hand-rolled twists. Cigarettes, once a curiosity, were beginning to attract attention. The Dukes faced a choice: remain small, traditional farmers, or risk everything by stepping into a new, untested industry. It was here that the first spark of ambition ignited. Washington Duke and his sons realized that their future could not remain tied to local sales. They needed to dream bigger, move faster, and face competition on a new level. This decision would lead them from the quiet fields of North Carolina into the storm of national industry, a journey filled with danger, sacrifice, and transformation. By the 1870s, the Dukes had moved beyond the desperate years of mere survival. Washington Duke and his sons, especially James Buchanan Buck Duke, began to see that their small family business could become something much larger. But the leap from a local farm operation to a national enterprise was no gentle climb. It was a storm of struggle, uncertainty, and risk. the family's first bold step was to invest in machinery. Until then, most tobacco in North Carolina was prepared by hand, rolled into plugs or twists. Cigarettes, though known in Europe, were still unusual in America. They were delicate, time-consuming to produce, and seen as a luxury item for the wealthy. Yet Buck Duke had vision. He believed that if cigarettes could be made cheaply and quickly, they would spread across the nation like wildfire. To chase this dream, the Duke scraped together resources and purchased one of the earliest cigarette rolling machines. It was called the Bonsack machine, an invention that could roll thousands of cigarettes per hour, something no group of workers could ever match. But adopting it came with enormous risk. Many in the tobacco industry mocked the idea. They insisted Americans preferred chewing tobacco or traditional smoking methods. For the Dukes to bet their future on a machine that most dismissed as foolish seemed reckless. The struggle was not only about technology. It was also about reputation and survival in a cutthroat market. Larger companies dominated distribution, controlling networks of buyers, stores, and even political influence. The Dukes, still newcomers, had to fight for every contract and every customer. Buck Duke, though young, proved relentless. He traveled across states, persuading shopkeepers, negotiating with suppliers, and boldly promoting his family's product. Every deal carried the possibility of failure, and every investment could have ruined them. The social climate added another layer of difficulty. The South was still economically weak, and many people viewed the Dukes' rise with suspicion. Some saw them as opportunists who had escaped the fate of poverty only by selling a vice. Others resented their ambition in a culture that often valued tradition over innovation. Washington Duke himself struggled with these tensions. As a devout Methodist, he wrestled with the morality of tobacco. But he also believed deeply in building a future for his children and in using wealth, once gained, for greater purposes. Within the family, the pressure was constant. Days were long, nights were short, and every member worked. Failure would not only mean financial ruin but also the loss of everything they had rebuilt after the war. The Dukes endured exhaustion, doubt, and the heavy toll of risk. Yet out of this crucible of struggle came resilience. One of the most symbolic moments of this period was Buck Duke's decision to challenge the tobacco elite head-on. He began to slash cigarette prices, using the efficiency of the Bonsack machine to undercut rivals. Competitors were furious. They accused the Dukes of destroying the industry, and some tried to crush them with lawsuits and smear campaigns. But Buck refused to retreat. His courage was not just in embracing innovation but in enduring the storms it created. It is worth pausing to ask ourselves, how many of us, faced with ridicule, financial danger, and social judgment, would still press forward? Could we take the leap, trusting a dream that few others believed in? The Dukes pressed forward. They fought for survival with every sale, every risk, and every sleepless night. And slowly, painfully, their gamble began to show results. Cigarettes, once a rarity, started to spread. The machine that others had laughed at became their greatest weapon. The struggle was far from over, but the first journey, from the ashes of war to the threshold of industry, was underway. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, the Duke family had planted themselves firmly in the tobacco trade. But being in the business was not enough for Buck Duke. He wanted to dominate it. And to do so, he would take risks that seemed reckless, almost impossible, yet would change the history of American industry. The turning point began with the Bonsack machine. While most tobacco producers rejected it, Buck saw its true potential. He negotiated an extraordinary deal with the Bonsack Company. If the Dukes used the machine exclusively, they would receive a special discount on production costs. This meant that every cigarette rolled by the Dukes could be sold cheaper than their competitors, a crushing advantage in a market driven by price. At first, rivals laughed. They believed the machine-made cigarette was inferior, tasteless, and unworthy of serious customers. But Buck was not just a manufacturer, he was a strategist. He poured money into advertising, one of the first businessmen in America to use mass marketing on such a scale. Posters, handbills, and even trading cards featuring beautiful images of women or flags of nations were tucked into cigarette packs. These small tokens made smoking fashionable, even collectible. Suddenly, the machine-made cigarette became desirable, not cheap, not second-rate, but modern and stylish. This was revolutionary. By the mid-1880s, demand for Duke cigarettes exploded. Rivals who once mocked the machine now panicked, struggling to compete with prices they could not match. Some tried to copy the Dukes, but Buck's exclusive deal with Bonsack ensured they would always be one step ahead. Yet success did not come without enemies. Other tobacco barons, enraged at the Dukes' rise, banded together to squeeze them out of the market. Distribution channels were blocked, contracts sabotaged, and bitter accusations flew in newspapers. It was a battle not just of business, but of willpower. Buck Duke, however, thrived in conflict. He responded by expanding even further, sending Duke products north into New York, west into Chicago, and eventually across the ocean to Europe. The decisive moment came in 1890, when Buck Duke led the creation of the American Tobacco Company. This was not just a business merger, it was an empire. By joining forces with several other companies, some willing, others pressured, the Dukes created a monopoly so powerful that it controlled nearly 90% of the U.S. cigarette market. Competitors were no longer rivals, they were subjects under the shadow of Duke power. For Washington Duke, now an old man, this turning point was bittersweet. He had built his family's foundation with sweat and faith, and now saw his son transform it into something unimaginable, an industrial giant. But with this power came new challenges. Newspapers and politicians accused the Dukes of greed, of crushing competition unfairly, of building wealth on addiction. Washington, a man of simple values, often retreated into silence, leaving Buck to shoulder the firestorm. The creation of the American Tobacco Company was the defining moment in the family's story. It was here that ambition crossed into empire, where a struggling farm family became the rulers of a national industry. It also marked the beginning of the Dukes' most difficult moral struggles. Could they use such power responsibly? Would the fortune born of tobacco become a curse, or could it be transformed into something greater? This was the great turning point, from survival to dominance, from mocked innovators to feared monopolists. It was a leap so vast that even those inside the family may have wondered if destiny had carried them too far. And yet, out of this transformation came the seeds of another future, the idea that wealth, however earned, could be turned into a legacy of education, opportunity, and service. The path to that transformation, however, would be marked by conflict, sacrifice, and choices that would test the very soul of the Dukes. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Duke family stood at the very peak of American industry. Their American Tobacco Company was vast, controlling factories, warehouses, shipping lines, and markets not only across the United States but also in Europe and Asia. Buck Duke, once dismissed as a reckless dreamer, had become one of the most powerful industrialists in the nation. Yet at that very height of power came the storm of conflict that would threaten everything the dukes had built. Public opinion turned sharply against them. Newspapers called Buck a tobacco king, but not always with admiration. Critics accused him of crushing small businesses, of using unfair tactics, and of turning a plant into an addiction that enslaved millions. Washington Duke, before his death in 1905, had urged his sons to use their wealth wisely, to give back, to make their fortune a force for good. But for Buck, caught in the battle for control, the line between ambition and morality grew dangerously thin. The greatest blow came from the U.S. government. In 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt's administration filed an antitrust lawsuit against the American Tobacco Company. The government accused the Dukes of creating an illegal monopoly, strangling competition, and abusing power. For Buck, this was more than a business dispute, it was a trial of his life's work. The lawsuit dragged on for years, with investigators combing through contracts and secret deals, painting the Dukes as ruthless emperors of an empire built on smoke. The conflict was brutal. Stock prices fell, allies turned cautious, and enemies grew bold. Buck Duke, once feared, now found himself cornered by forces even he could not control. The company spent millions in legal fees, and Buck himself was dragged into courtrooms, his name splashed across headlines. The proud empire builder had to sit silently while lawyers attacked his character, questioning not only his business but his humanity. Behind the scenes, sacrifice was everywhere. Workers feared losing jobs if the company collapsed. Families who depended on Duke wages prayed for survival. Even within the family, tension grew. Washington Duke's vision of honest hard work seemed far away from the shadow of monopoly and scandal. Some of the Duke children, particularly Benjamin N. Duke, argued more strongly for philanthropy, urging that their fortune be shared to lift the South from poverty and ignorance. Buck, however, was consumed with saving the empire. The climax came in 1911, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against the American Tobacco Company. The justices declared it an unlawful monopoly and ordered it broken apart into several smaller companies. For Buck Duke, it was a crushing defeat. The empire he had fought for, sacrificed for, and defended at all costs was dismantled by the stroke of a pen. Yet here lay the moment of choice. Buck could have retreated into bitterness, guarding what remained of his fortune, nursing anger at the government and his critics. Instead, the Dukes, shaped by both Washington's early lessons and the weight of responsibility, began to shift their vision. If their empire could no longer dominate tobacco, perhaps their legacy could rise in another form. This was where the true sacrifice appeared. The Dukes began to pour their wealth into philanthropy, especially education. In 1924, the Duke Endowment was established, one of the largest charitable trusts in America, dedicated to supporting hospitals, orphanages, the Methodist Church, and above all, higher education. What had once been profit from cigarettes was now transformed into scholarships, buildings, and opportunities for young men and women who might otherwise have been forgotten. The climax of conflict had demanded both loss and transformation. Buck Duke gave up the dream of absolute industrial control, but in doing so, he made a choice that turned power into legacy. He accepted that wealth, no matter how great, could not endure without purpose. The empire of smoke would fade, but the empire of learning could last for generations. And so, at the very peak of struggle, the Dukes chose to shift from ambition alone to service, from dominance to destiny. That choice would shape not only their family but also the very landscape of American education. Out of the ashes of conflict rose the greatest achievement of the Duke family, not the factories they built, nor the cigarettes they sold, but the institutions that carried their name into the future. With the creation of the Duke Endowment in 1924, Buck Duke ensured that his family's wealth would not vanish into dust or greed, but instead serve as a beacon for generations to come. The endowment was vast, $40 million at the time, one of the largest charitable trusts in American history. Its purpose was clear: to support education, hospitals, rural churches, and care for orphans. This was Washington Duke's dream finally made real. The man who had once returned from war to an empty farm could never have imagined that his family would one day fund schools and hospitals across the South. But the crown jewel of their achievements was Duke University. Originally called Trinity College, this small Methodist school in Durham, North Carolina, had long struggled with limited resources. The Dukes had been supporting it for years, but in 1924, James B. Duke's endowment transformed it completely. Trinity College was renamed Duke University in honor of Washington Duke, the father who had built the family's foundation with faith and hard work. The transformation was breathtaking. With new funding, the campus expanded dramatically. Gothic towers rose from the Carolina soil, crowned by the magnificent Duke Chapel, whose soaring stone walls and stained glass windows became symbols of aspiration and spiritual vision. The university grew in prestige, attracting students and scholars from across the nation and the world. It was not just a school, it was a living monument to the power of resilience and the belief that education could change lives. Achievements stretched far beyond Durham. Hospitals across North Carolina received funding to expand, bringing medical care to people who had never known such services. Methodist churches and rural communities found strength through grants that kept small congregations alive. Orphans, who once faced lives of hopelessness, were given homes, care, and opportunities. In each of these acts, the Duke's fortune was reshaped into something noble and enduring. For Buck Duke, these achievements were his vindication. Though critics never stopped questioning the morality of tobacco wealth, they could not deny the impact of his philanthropy. The Duke Endowment became one of the cornerstones of Southern progress in the 20th century, a symbol that even fortunes born of controversy could fuel a higher purpose. There is a deep symbolism here. The Dukes had once grown a crop that consumed bodies, but now they grew institutions that nourished minds and healed wounds. Out of smoke rose stone towers. Out of risk and ruin rose opportunity and hope. This was the victory they could never have imagined in those early days, when Washington Duke struggled to feed his children after the Civil War. Let us pause for a moment and imagine, if you stood on Duke University's campus today, gazing up at the chapel's spire, could you feel the echo of that journey? From a broken farm to an industrial empire, from controversy to legacy, what would Washington Duke think, if he could walk those grounds and see what his family's sacrifices had built? The victory of the Dukes was not the empire of tobacco alone. It was the empire of transformation. And in that transformation, they proved that even flawed beginnings can lead to enduring good. The story of the Duke family is one of the most paradoxical and inspiring in American history. It begins with hardship, a poor farmer returning from war to nothing but ashes. It rises through ambition and risk, as a family dares to bet their future on a controversial crop and an untested machine. It reaches conflict at the height of empire, when power becomes a burden and morality a haunting question. And finally, it ends with transformation, as fortune is poured into education, health, and community. What lesson lies at the heart of this story? Perhaps it is this: greatness is not measured only by wealth, but by what we do with it. The Dukes could have kept their fortune locked away, living in luxury while the world judged them. Instead, they chose to give back, to invest in knowledge and healing. In doing so, they turned a story of tobacco into a story of hope. Their legacy is not without shadows. Tobacco remains a product linked to addiction and disease, and history will always remember that truth. Yet history also remembers the chapel that rises above Durham, the scholarships that lifted young people into opportunity, the hospitals that saved lives, and the communities that endured because of the Duke endowment. Out of controversy, the family carved meaning. Out of criticism, they created compassion. For us, as learners and dreamers, the Duke story carries another lesson: resilience. Washington Duke could have surrendered when war destroyed his farm. Buck Duke could have retreated when the government dismantled his empire. Instead, both found new paths, proving that failure is never final unless we allow it to be. And so, the Dukes remind us of a timeless truth: we are not defined only by where we begin, or even by the mistakes we make along the way, but by the choices we embrace when the world tests us most. What about you? If you faced the weight of defeat, or the judgment of others, how would you choose to rise? Would you fight for survival, transform loss into legacy, and turn criticism into compassion? The Dukes did. And that is why their story, complex as it is, still inspires us today. Their name is not just tied to a product but to a university, a chapel, and a vision that learning, healing, and faith can carry a family's legacy far beyond its origins. Dear learners, you have now walked through the story of the Duke family, a journey from hardship to empire, from empire to conflict, and from conflict to legacy. Their path was not simple, and their choices were not without controversy. Yet from the soil of North Carolina rose one of the greatest examples of how resilience, vision, and transformation can shape history. Washington Duke once said, "I have tried never to forget the poor and the needy." These words capture the spirit that survived within his family, even as wealth and power grew. They remind us that greatness is not about avoiding struggle but about lifting others as we rise. What can you take from this story into your own life? You may not build an empire or found a university, but you carry the same power the Dukes discovered, the power to rise from failure, to transform hardship into purpose, and to leave a mark that outlives you. If this story moved you, share it. Tell others about the journey of the Dukes, about their struggles and their legacy. Carry forward the lesson that even from difficult or flawed beginnings, something noble can emerge. And of course, if you'd like to support our work, so that we can continue bringing you powerful stories for learning and inspiration, please like, comment, subscribe, or share this video. Your encouragement helps us keep creating content that connects history, language, and human values. Until next time, dear learners, keep learning, keep growing, and keep believing in your own journey. For every challenge carries within it the seed of transformation. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next story.